Da-na-na-da-da-da-da. Da-na-na-da. I know that's super uncomfortable, but tell you what, I love Thomas the Train. I watched Thomas my whole life whenever I was a kid, and as an adult, both of my boys, I have two sons, both of them watched Thomas from the time they were really, really little. Not just because it's entertaining and fun, but because it teaches values that are important to believers in Jesus. They're Christian values, they're values about working as a team, about having integrity, about being truthful, working hard, being just being a good servant of the Lord, a good friend of Jesus. So I love Thomas. And today, that's what we're talking about. We're talking about Thomas the Train. Now, Thomas the Train was created by a man named William Awdry. Well, I just realized as I edit this episode that I called him William for like the first half of the episode. It's Wilbert. I don't know why. My brain was just not working the way it should have. So it's Wilbert. All right. I'm sorry. It's not William, it's Wilbert. William Awdry was born in 1911 on June 15th in England, and essentially he grew up in a Christian home. He believed in Jesus his whole life, and he kind of always had this childlike wonder and love for the Lord and for trains, of course. That makes a lot of sense. His love for trains came from growing up near a railroad track. And at most of the trains, they would pass at night, and as they would pass by, he would listen to these trains. Now, he was in a little bit of a unique situation because as these trains would go by, where he specifically lived was an incline. So these trains, they would be puff, 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 puffing up these different, up this hill. And he, because he had no other entertainment or he couldn't sleep or whatever, he would lay in bed at night listening to the different sounds that different kinds of trains made. And it was through that he began to imagine that these trains had different personalities because they made very different sounds based on the type of train, how much weight it was carrying, all of these different reasons as to why the train might. He also listened to the specific whistles that the conductors would whistle to each other. They were these different codes, how they would communicate. And Awdry said this about his childhood. There was no doubt in my mind that steam engines all had different personalities. I would hear them snorting up the grade, and little imagination was needed to hear in the puffings and pantings of the two engines the conversation they were having with one another. So from the time he was very young, trains had these personalities. But his very first love was God. And so as an adult, he went through ministerial training and he became a reverend through the Anglican Church and dedicated his life to preaching the gospel and telling people about Jesus. However, as most ministers do, I am a minister myself, we have other things we like to do. For example, I like to share about church history. I like to narrate audiobooks. I like to do all kinds of things. He was no different. And he loved making train models, and in his mind, he always had this vivid imagination, especially about trains, because he loved them so much. And one day, his son Christopher got sick with the measles. This is in 1942. His son is sick, can't get out of bed, is confined to just being in his room all the time. And so Wilbert decided to entertain his son using the stories that were in his imagination when he was a child. So he begins to tell Christopher about all these different trains. Specifically, he tells them about Gordon and Edward, and this begins to fascinate Christopher as well. And so, as a father-son project, Christopher and Wilbert, they decided to start making model engines together. The very first model train that they created was Edward. After this, they wanted to make Gordon, but because of the wars going on, there was a lack of materials to make a larger train. So they ended up making a smaller little tank engine, who then became known as Thomas. Thomas was just the perfect name for a little engine. And thus was born Thomas the Tank Engine. After they create these models, Christopher is so excited and loves this so much that he keeps asking Wilbert, his father, to keep coming up with new stories to tell him what was going on in Thomas's life, Thomas's adventures, and Gordon and Edward and all these other tank engines that Wilbert was inventing. Well, Wilbert started to write down these stories and eventually created the very first book that was called Thomas the Tank Engine. This was in 1946. He starts to send this book out to these publishers. Nobody's accepting them. He's getting rejected over and over and over again, as is the story of most authors, most people trying to do anything. There's a lot of rejection. And all this time, he is preaching the gospel, he's pastoring his church, and he's continuing on with his regular life as he sends out these railroad stories, not having any idea what's about to happen, how his life is about to change dramatically, and yet not change in its fundamental core of what he believed. So finally, his book gets picked up and it gets published. The very first Thomas the Tank Engine story gets published, and it is a huge hit. Children everywhere are falling in love with Thomas. They're reading these stories, they're imagining these stories, and Wilbert sees that this is a way to instill Christian values into children's lives. This wasn't just some sort of entertainment business for him. For him, this was a way to tell people how to be good followers of Jesus. For him, in essence, it was an evangelistic tool. And for him, he saw it as a way to reach lots and lots of people, which is exactly what he was doing. Now, another part of Thomas the Tank Engine that made it so unique and so special was that Wilbert, he believed in absolutely instilling not just all of the highlights and all the good parts of Christian life or just life in general. He wanted to make sure to show the tank engines or the diesel engines or whatever kind of engines as real human beings who were trying to live life in a way that was good and pure and holy, but really struggling with the sin nature that is within them. Which is why in every story of Thomas the Tank Engine, we kind of see the same themes, right? There's all kinds of different stories, but at the end of the day, there's always Thomas or one of the other tank engines. They're struggling with some kind of it's like a moral dilemma, right? They want to be good and useful engines, but they want to beat this other person, and so they end up causing crashes because they're being too competitive. And there's bickering among them, and there's arguing, and there's gossiping. So he wanted to really show the very human side and show kids that even though you struggle with these things, you can overcome them and you can actually live this good, pure, holy life, which is back in those days. I mean, this was groundbreaking to have this place called Sodor that was telling children how to live pure lives and not just showing all the highlights. This is a little bunny trail here. This is one of my biggest issue with reading stories like missionary stories or especially in church history. We have this big tendency to only see or read about the highlights of what happened. And very often we miss out on the truths and how difficult the situations were. And so this is what Wilbert didn't want to happen. He didn't want to tell these fluffy stories that don't confront real truth and real humanity. And so he would put these characteristics into all of the different trains. You know, you had some that were more gung-ho and they wanted to fight and win. And then you had others that were cowardly. You had others that were lying or scheming. And then you had all these different personalities. And then to tie it all together, we had Sir Topham Hatt, who Sir Topham Hatt was supposed to represent God in many ways. He was fun, jolly. He was there to give guidance, but he could also be very strict and very stern. And he would very straight up, he would tell the tank engines whenever they'd done something wrong. And it's a really beautiful thing because it shows how well Wilbert knew God, because he didn't show God as just like he's there with a bat, he's there with a hammer just waiting to smash people in because they made mistakes. No, he showed them as loving, kind, accepting, understanding each train's different personality trait, how to deal with them individually. And it's just genius, absolutely genius. Near the end of Wilbert's life, there was a biographer that asked him how he wanted to be remembered. He said that he hoped that people would remember him as someone who helped people see God in the ordinary things of life, and that he made children laugh. That was the core of everything that he did, whether it was in his ministry, whether it was in Thomas the Tank Engine. His core was let people see God and make children laugh. He had such an awesome heart, such a pure heart. And of course, trains were such a huge part of his life that his nickname was the Puff Puff Pastor. Not because today people would twist it into smoking and all that kind of stuff, but in those days it was Puff Puff Pastor because of the smoke that would come out of the train's steam stacks or whatever they're called, their heads. The smoke. I'm not a train guy. I just love Thomas the Tank Engine. In 1997, the Bishop of Gloucester said something that I think is so profound about Wilbert. He said this: Wilbert passes into immortality as one of God's really useful priests and servants. He was not overcome by the glamour of being a famous author or deflected from his dedication to the priesthood. He never wavered in his basic biblical and simple faith. That is the core of Awdry. He absolutely loved the Lord, and he always said it was God first, children's stories second. Now, we're not quite done here, because as time has gone by, as we've seen in so many different really pure, really wonderful TV shows, that once the founder has died, and time has gone on and the world is getting more and more corrupt, people have taken Thomas the Tank Engine and a lot of these great shows and have corrupted them. They've turned them into these worldly things that are, instead of promoting Christian values that they were originally made for, a lot of these values are getting removed, and they're starting to promote things that are completely anti-scriptural, completely anti-biblical Jesus. They're against God. And about a decade ago, this started to happen with Thomas the Tank Engine. There was a DVD that came out that was called Keeping Up with James. And this was supposed to be a Christmas story that largely focused on a story with James, the train, James, not the Bible character James. And in there, they removed the name Christmas from the Christmas tree. They removed all references to the actual Christmas story about Jesus and just made it a holiday tree. And they made it more about the presents and everything. And the daughter of Wilbert Awdry was really upset about this. And her name is Hilary Fortnum. And she actually did an interview with the Daily Telegraph. And she said that she was dismayed by this story. She said, "It is not what my father, the Reverend Wilbert Awdry, wrote. He always impressed on reporters and publishers that he was a priest first and a children's author second." And then she went on to say, "Political correctness against Christian belief offends." And this is exactly what is happening all over the world. Anything that's moral, anything that has been written to promote good things has been twisted into promoting evil things. This is exactly what we see. I'm not going to go into a sermon here, but this is exactly what Scripture says was going to happen. That good will be called evil and evil will be called good. That is exactly what we're seeing. Thomas the Tank Engine, Arthur the Aardvark, which was also one of my favorite shows, has gone from being these wonderful shows that promote Christian values and love and how to just be decent moral humans into things that are promoting the most depraved, twisted things that are on our earth right now. Now, just to wrap up the story of Wilbert Awdry, I don't want to go off on a tangent on my own things that irritate me about what the world is doing. We're believers. We're going to stand strong. We're going to take this back because God is faithful and he's going to be with us. We're going to see another revival. I'm sure of it. We're at the brink of it. I love revival. I teach a whole course on it. Maybe I'll put it up on my website sometime. For anyone who wants to see it. So Wilbert Awdry, after writing 26 books on Thomas the Tank Engine, he died on March 21st, 1997 at the age of 85. He died peacefully in his sleep. And the wonderful thing, and I love this because I have two sons, his son Christopher, after he died, he went in to write another, I believe it was 19 titles. I don't have the number right in front of me. I believe it was another 19 titles from Thomas the Tank Engine. And he and Wilbert's children oversee his estate, as you can call it, his legacy. So it's such a beautiful story, and to know that his whole life was about teaching people to follow Jesus is so powerful, even through the creativity of Thomas the Tank Engine. That should say something to us. that we too should be able to use creativity to reach people with the gospel. Thank you for joining me. I'll see you in the next one.